Time for the Archive Hour. When the Beatles set up their own business in 1968, they had no intention of confining its activities to music making. It was hoped that their company, Apple, could create just about anything. One plan was to record the thoughts of the 60s counterculture in a series of experimental albums which would be released on the Zapple label. Beatles' intimate Barry Miles was put in charge of capturing the zeitgeist, and this is his account of the experience. Z is for Zapple, the last Beatles story to remain untold.
Yes, it is. I'll bring it. And, well, it all started there. There. It's all started there. Back on the docks. My mother was a seaman, and my father was a Jew. My granddad came from Ireland, and that's enough.
In the summer of 1965, Paul McCartney became a regular visitor to my flat in Hanson Street in the West End of London. He was very interested in the contemporary art scene, and I would play him avant-garde jazz records and electronic music, and lent him books and magazines. In turn, Paul introduced me to R&B and little-known Motown tracks. We discussed the idea of releasing an audio equivalent of the avant-garde magazines, where, instead of a review of a poetry reading, listeners would hear extracts from the reading itself, or maybe clips from concerts, rehearsals, or even items from the third program that people might have missed. It was agreed that what we needed in order to do this was a small studio where writers and musicians could record without the overheads of a commercial facility. We'd heard that Beatles manager Brian Epstein was buying a small office building, and we secured space on the top floor where a recording studio was to be installed. The core team consisted of myself, John Dunbar, Ian Somerville, and Peter Asher. Our first release was to feature a long electronic piece by Paul McCartney, a Mutter poem by Pete Brown based on the work of Kurt Schwitters, and a story. But when Epstein decided against buying the building, Paul found us temporary accommodation at Ringo Starr's old flat in Montague Square.
What's happened to the tape recorder?
The carousel of life. I do, Jack. Really is a wizard, do, really. No, honestly. It's a biffo, do this.
The sounds of a happy party, recorded live at the Apollo basement in Montague Square.
We have some echo on this, please. It's amazing what it does to your voice, isn't it?
Oh, not half. It's really nice. Really nice.
Well, I've only just come down for the
really
exhibition,
nice.
but...
Well, I mean, we don't get
I'm
paid,
amazed
you know,
at what I see.
No, quite.
I mean, I didn't know
right.
the modern world.
No, I wouldn't have believed it myself
was
either.
Moving forward at
No,
such a
I wouldn't have
pace.
done. I mean, they seem to be running.
Paul paid for Ian Somerville to equip the flat at Montague Square with a pair of Revox tape recorders, microphones, and so on, and Somerville moved into the building so as always to be on hand to engineer. No records ever got made there, but Paul used the studio to demo songs such as Eleanor Rigby. William Burroughs was a regular visitor.
He may not know anything about how the engines work, or even the principle on which the capsule is operating. Oh, he should. He should. He should, but he usually doesn't.
Is this machine recording?
30 families are homeless in fires. Police said the dead man, Thomas Walton, of 371 West 116th Street, apparently touched off with accumulated grease in the kitchen exhaust ducts, had caught fire, and I wished I knew. Evacuated were allowed to return later. Customers of McGinnis Restaurant at Broadway and 48th Street got their dinner free last night, or at least
concept. So it was used in shop windows, and it was used on magazine covers. I think we all knew it was important because the Beatles were at their peak. They could do anything. I mean, something happened where Joseph Lockwood, who's the head of EMI, didn't want something done. And as I remember it, they more or less said, well, there won't be an album. We either do it or you're not getting the album. I mean, they were that powerful. So we could do what we wanted. I mean, it was like a wonderful sort of excuse to do whatever we wanted.
By now, the Beatles were no longer the Fab Four of old. They were more like princes of psychedelia. In those days, rock and roll was taken very seriously, and their opinions on everything mattered. The following year, the band established its own company, Apple Corps. This aspired to be much more than a record label. Instead, it was to be a sort of underground arts council where the unsigned, the unpublished, and the unloved could come and get a fair hearing from the world's most successful artists. Old friends from the heyday of Beatlemania were approached to staff the new venture, most notably press officer Derek Taylor.
I got a call from all four on what the Americans call a conference call. One morning I was in bed with my wife in Grandview Drive, Hollywood, movie capital of the world. And George said, this is George. And then Paul said, this is Paul, and so on. Would you like to come and run Apple Records? Yes, I said. Certainly I'll come and run Apple Records. And the original idea that was put to me was that they would buy an estate, and we would all live on it. There'd be a big dome in the middle, which would be Apple, and then there'd be 4 corridors leading to 4 large houses, one for John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and around the estate there'd be other houses, sort of the gardeners' domes, and we'd live in there. The reality was that they didn't buy an estate because land being what it is, the nearest place they could get was Norwich, which nobody could see us running a record company out of Norwich, crazy though we were. So I guess you settle for compromises, and we ended up in a big 18th century house in Savile Row, number 3.
I found myself in London in the spring of 1968, and I had heard that there was this company being started called Apple, and it was the Beatles' new venture into corporate life, and they're going to start a company that's going to be involved in electronics and motion pictures and publishing and music publishing and turn the world around on its ear.
Thousands of people wanted to work for Apple, but only those with contacts got in. Richard DeLello, a young American abroad, was quick off the mark.
I just happened to know their former press agent, who had become their press agent once again, and I called him on the phone, and he said, come in, and I said, Derek, I need a job. In those days, all you had to do is just sort of pick up the phone and do a little talking, and I got the job. I think I got there about 9 o'clock every morning, between 9 and 9:30, and you'd just walk into this blizzard of telephones ringing, and it was someone trying to get to John Lennon, someone trying to get to George, any number of guests who wanted to come in and people who wanted to meet the Beatles, and that was also part of the job, trying to figure out who would get to be in their presence that day or that week or next month.
Meanwhile, John Dunbar, Peter Asher, and I had started Indica, an art gallery and bookshop designed to mount challenging exhibitions, hold poetry readings, and import obscure literary magazines. But Indica was undercapitalized, and by October 1968, we were in serious financial trouble. Paul McCartney had helped set the place up, painting the walls and putting up shelves, so I reluctantly approached him for help. He wrote me a sizable check and went on to suggest that Apple could reactivate our old idea of inexpensive spoken word and experimental albums, and that this would be a good way of involving Indica with Apple. Here's Peter Asher.
Paul was round at my house one day, and he was just talking about this idea he'd had, because it was him that thought of the name and things. And he had an idea for Apple, and this was when it was a very huge idea. It was going to be just everything, you know, films, theater, television, records, spaceships, you know, I mean, there was just no limit to what Apple was going to be. And we were talking about the record division. I was starting to produce records and things. Nothing had really been a hit, but Paul had liked the things that I was doing. Then when Apple finally got going, it materialized that I really was head of A&R, and so that was really our next sort of professional involvement.
Here's a poem that I wrote before I got married. I never thought I'd read it again. I'd like to try it. It's good for reading loud. It's called Marriage. Should I get married? Should I be good? Astound the girl next door with my velvet suit and Faustus hood? Don't take her to movies, but to cemeteries. Tell her all about werewolf bathtubs and forked clarinets. Then desire her and kiss her and all the preliminaries. And she going just so far, and I understanding why. Not getting angry, saying, you must feel, it's beautiful to feel. Instead, take her in my arms, lean against an old crooked tombstone, and woo her the entire night to constellations in the sky. When she introduces me to her parents, back straightened, hair finely combed, strangled by a tie, should I sit knees together on their third-degree sofa and not ask, where's the bathroom?
That's the New York beat poet Gregory Corso, from an album I recorded in June 1965 at the Architectural Association in London, which also featured Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Andrea Wozniacki. I was keen to expand this idea into a series, so I drew up a list of mostly American writers whom I wanted to record, including Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti again, Richard Brautigan, Charles Olson, Henry Miller, Charles Bukowski, William Burroughs, Ken Kesey, and Anais Nin. There were plans for a second list of British writers, including the Mersey poets. Paul wanted to issue radio plays as well as concerts of experimental music, lectures and conversations, such as Burroughs talking about drugs, or the Beatles themselves discussing their latest projects. Anything could be released as a record. Paul okayed my choices there and then, and, once the idea had been approved by all four Beatles, we had the green light. John Lennon named the new label Zapple, and he and Yoko suggested adding Gregory Corso and Anne Waldman to my list. I was appointed label manager and became a regular at Savile Row. Boxes of Beatles albums were mailed to Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Indira Gandhi and others, along with invitations to record their thoughts for Zapple, but none of them replied. Allen Ginsberg was the first name on my list, and, rather than commit to an album of poetry, he suggested recording his musical renditions of William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. I organized my first recording trip for January 1969. My plan was to hire a portable Nagra tape machine in New York, where I would record the thoughts of Texan poet Ken Weaver.
What do you want to try next? Do you want to carry on with the El Canto?
Well, let me see. I don't know if I can think of anything.
Or going to New York, Lower East Side.
Yeah, the Lower East Side. I moved to the Lower East Side on May Day of 1964, and I got a typical Lower East Side Puerto Rican pink and blue apartment, 4 rooms, straight in a line, no lights in 2 of them. Furnished it off the street. Rent was $72 a month, which was incredible.
Ken Weaver was a founder member of the Fugs, the radical, pornographic, anti-war folk rock combo. We had arranged to record an album of text speak, basically bar conversation with humor in a Texan accent. The location was Weaver's apartment on East 9th Street between C and D, at that time a highly dangerous part of town. The recording process was not helped by the sound of local kids stripping a car in the street below.
Talking drums. Yeah. Background music, buddy. Ah! I got a dying baby in here and needs some sleep, okay? I got a sick kid in here and needs some sleep. Thank you.
Despite the noises off, I managed to record hours of Ken's musings on mainstream American culture.
Reel 2.
Welcome to Hollywood Cliché-O-Rama. Your favorite selected lines from your favorite selected movies. Near the body there were tracks, much like those of a wolf
Kiss? What is kiss, Capitan Steve? Oh, Artie, prison's done something to you.
There's a name for women like you.
Dad, what do we do if the vet can't help Rusty?
Men, you're all aware of what we're up against. Yes, Raymond will play in the Rose Bowl. Lots of Raymonds will.
I like the way you handle your mitts, kid.
Call off your men, Quincannon. Janie, are you in love with that mug? Give it to me straight, Doc.
I hate you, I hate you, I hate you.
She hates me because I'm an ugly hunchback. Why? Why, that's the mogul diamond worth a king's ransom.
This god of yours.
Marry me and I swear I'll change. That's all.
I left Kenweaver and the Lower East Side and headed to Fort Square in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I was to record Charles Olson at home in his railroad flat. Olson had been the rector of the famous Black Mountain College. He was a friend of Ezra Pound and had had a great influence on the Beat generation and the School of New York poets. He slept through the day, so we had to work at night, which was better for our recordings, as the only other sound to be heard was the occasional truck passing through the deep snow outside.
I am the gold machine, and now I have trenched out, smeared. The tone's big, but let's do. I am the gold machine. It's the thing is so efficient. Oh, what a machine. I am the gold machine, and now I have trenched out.
Though he was only 59, Olson was ill and was to die within the year. As we talked, he gestured to a large chart on the wall, showing details of ships' captains and cargoes from the port of Gloucester in the 18th century. When I clearly lost the thread of what he was talking about, he slightly irritably turned to point to the chart, but it was blank, bleached by the sun years before. He gave me a look that showed he knew he had not long to live.
This is called Maximus letter number whatever, and starts chock-a-block. Once a man was traveling through the woods, and he heard some distance off a sound of feet beating the ground. He went to find the people who made the sound, and it was a full week before he came to them. It was a man and his wife dancing around a tree, in the top of which was a raccoon. By their constant treading, they had worn a trench in the ground and were in it up to their waists. When the man asked them why they did it, they said they were hungry and they were trying to dance the tree down to catch the raccoon. Now, the man told them there was a better way to fell a tree, a new way, and he showed them how to cut it down, in return for which he asked the skin if they had the meat of the raccoon. So they tanned it, and off he went. Another distance in the path in the forest, he met another man who was carrying his house on his head. He was frightened at first, but the man put his house down and shook hands with him, and while they had a smoke together and talked, the man noticed the raccoon skin and asked where he got it. He told him, from the dancing man and his wife. This was enough to get the other started. He offered him anything for the skin, and finally his house. Looking it over, our man was delighted to find it had so many rooms and such good furniture. But he said, I never could carry it as you do. Yes, said the man, who belonged somewhere else. Just try it. And he found he could. It was as light as a basket. So he went off carrying his house until night, when he came to a hardwood ridge near a good spring of water and put it down. Inside was a wide bed covered with a white bearskin, and it was very soft, and he was tired, and he slept very well. In the morning it was even better. Hanging from the beams were deer meat, hams, duck, baskets of berries, and maple sugar. And as he reached out for them, the rug itself melted and it was white snow, and his arms turned into wings, and he flew up to the food, and it was birch boughs on which it hung, and he was a partridge, and it was spring.
The next stop on my trip was Allen Ginsberg's farm in upstate New York, where we discussed ideas for his album. At this time, Ginsberg was probably the most famous figure in the counterculture. As well as considering his thoughts on his LP of Blake's songs, we also planned to record a collection of Eastern chants and mantras. While I was staying with Alan, Zapple was officially launched back in London. Derek Taylor's press release announced that Zapple would pioneer a new area for the recording industry, equivalent to what the paperback revolution did to book publishing. Zapple, he promised, would bring sounds of all kinds, not necessarily music as you know it, love it, or fear it. There will be electronic sounds, spoken word, recorded interviews, thoughts and views of well-known people you've never heard of, but should have and will. Richard DeLello, by now known as Apple's house hippie, was there.
I was there to help Derek out. I mean, I was called the house hippie, but, I was a young man at the time in my early 20s, and I had the right look, and I was young and energetic, and so anything that needed doing, I was there to do. Zapple. I don't know, it just appeared one day. Derek told me that they were going to try and do sort of the alt Apple, as it was. A sort of a more progressive label of sort of boutique artists and poets, writers, etc. But it was always very much below the radar. They'd talk about it for a while, and then it would sort of disappear, and there was never a great deal of focus put upon it, as I remember. It was a concept way ahead of its time, and can't be too much ahead of your time, 6 months ahead of your time, a year, say, but more than that, then you leave everybody behind, scratching their head.
To get Zapple noticed, the first release was John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Life with the Lions, which established the label as experimental, opening out the borders of what constituted art or music.
I realized somebody else was as kind of balmy as me, could equally enjoy non-dance music or non-pop music that was, they call it avant-garde or whatever it is, things to hear in an earphone.
Is being kept under observation. I was invited to Cambridge to do a number, sort of avant-garde.
This is independent of me, though. There's nothing to do with
and
me.
They didn't realize that we were together, so to speak. So they didn't realize that, and they invited me, and so I said, well, all right, what shall I do? And Joe was saying, well, it's okay, why don't you go? And they're saying, well, are you going to bring a band or what, So Joan said, well, I'm the band, but don't tell them, I'll be the band, So I said, yes, I'll bring a band,
When we arrived in Cambridge, and it was supposed to be a avant-garde, that word again, jazz thing, right? And there was a guy called John Shakai, who was apparently a famous avant-garde sax guy, or jazz sax guy. I didn't know any of them. And a few people that I don't remember the names of, they were there too. And I turned up as her band, I just had a guitar and an amp, and that was the first time I played that style, just pure feedback and whatever it is on that track. And the audience were very weird, because they were all these sort of intellectual artsy-fartsies from Cambridge, and they were uptight because the rock and roll guy was there, even though I wasn't doing any rhythm. If you hear it, it's just pure sound, because what else can you do when a woman's howling, you just go along with it, right?
They were totally silent.
They were totally
very
silent.
polite.
Well, the reaction I got from the quote-unquote avant-garde group, not only in Cambridge, it was the same reaction that she got from the rock and roll people, like, what's she doing here? Or when I was doing the stuff with her, this little tight-knit avant-garde scene would be somewhat, who the hell is he? He's one of those pop.
This is a piece called Cambridge 1969.
Even for hardcore Beatles fans, Life with the Lions, with its sounds of the Lennon's baby's heartbeat hours before Yoko's miscarriage, and John and Yoko's unique performance style, was a hard listen. It was up to Richard DeLello to try and convince the press and public beyond.
I think, if anything, they were indifferent. There came a point when the press really did start to turn on the Beatles and become rather nasty, but I think initially they were still deeply in awe of them. Had the public responded in a more positive way, the press would have gone along with it. They were just sort of a weather vane looking to see, you know, which way the wind was going to blow on these things. You know, when John had hooked up with Yoko, they were going to be doing very avant-garde stuff. I think you knew what the expectations were. All, I think, great musicians are fiddlers. They just love fiddling with things and, you know, like building cars, and they're gear heads and tech heads, and they're basically kind of nerdy to a degree. And let a musician loose in a studio with all kinds of toys and he'll come up with something. And it's not going to be the sound of silence.
Hello? Hi. Yes, they've gone. We've had to switch microphones out here. It's fantastic. And this other engineer came out. We have a whole new set of microphones, condensers. Price is wired in here. He looks like something dropped from outer space. The place is just surrounded with electronic equipment. We have 4 microphones, stands, amplifiers, speakers, and wires all over the place. Like all we need is like a body to cut up and bring back to life. It's like a Frankenstein monster. It's incredible. Yeah, they left you about 15 minutes ago. We're afraid they're going to come back and bring more of this stuff. Okay. Bye-bye.
Back in the States, my next stop was East Hollywood, home to Charles Bukowski. Described as the poet laureate of Skid Row, Bukowski had worked as a mail sorter at the post office for the previous 10 years. He was an alcoholic, a gambler, a brawler, and the author of some of the most hard-hitting, direct, honest poetry ever written. He would later script the film Barfly, about 3 days in his life as a hardened drinker. Buck hated giving poetry readings and did not want to go into a studio, so I wired up his living room, showed him how to use an Ampex 3000, and left him to it. I headed for San Francisco, where I had arranged to record at the home of Richard Brautigan.
Here are the sounds of my life in San Francisco. Hungry?
Damn right. I don't know really what I want to have to eat.
We can get some steaks over at Safeway and bring it back here, and you like mushrooms
and
steaks.
Oh man, does that sound good?
And then we can throw a little salad together too, huh?
I'd like that. I'd like some fresh salad.
As well as documenting Brautigan's everyday life, we recorded selections of his poetry and prose. Brautigan's work had a strange, wide-eyed innocence about it. He caught the naivety, the sensitivity, and the idealism of the San Francisco hippie scene better than any other writer I knew.
This is a group of poems from my book, The Pill versus the Spring Hill Mine Disaster. The first poem is called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace.
Meanwhile, much to my surprise, Charles Bukowski had mastered my machinery and filled all 12 reels of tape, even trying to record on both sides.
Hello. Tape number 7, Bukowski. Side 1, we'll see how the tapes move out. It's supposed to be something arriving in registered mail, my latest poems coming out for my next book. I'm supposed to read them off, and nothing may ever show, nothing may ever be, nothing ever, nothing. A Catholic Mass, you know. Miles? Alright. Tape 7, Side 1, Probably just this side. Don't turn it over. On going out to get the mail, the droll noon where squadrons of worms creep up like stripteasers to be raped by blackbirds. I go outside, and all up and down the street, the green armies shoot color like an everlasting 4th of July. Yet I, too, seem to swell inside, a kind of unknown bursting, a feeling, perhaps, that there isn't any enemy anywhere. And I reach down into the box, and there is nothing. Not even a letter from the gas company saying they will shut it off again. Not even a short note from my ex-wife bragging upon her present happiness. My hand searches the mailbox in a kind of disbelief long after the mind has given up. There's not even a dead fly down in there. I am a fool, I think. I should have known it works like this. I go inside, as all the flowers leap to please me. Anything? The woman asks. Nothing, I answer. What's for breakfast?
Dove sta amore, where lies love? Dove sta amore, here lies love. The ringed of love in lyrical delight. Here love's hill song, love's true will song, love's low plain song, too sweet pain song in passages of night. Dove sta amore, here lies love, the ring of love. Dove sta amore, here lies love.
While in San Francisco, I block-booked Golden State Recorder's studio on Harrison Street, where I recorded beat poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti singing songs and reading poetry. Ferlinghetti was the founder of City Lights Books, the world's first paperback bookshop. He had published Allen Ginsberg's Howl back in 1955, and was, in 1969, America's best-selling poet. His poems were designed for public reading. They often made people smile or laugh aloud, and they usually contain some insight into the human condition that also made you think.
A serious poem about underwear. I didn't get much sleep last night thinking about underwear. Have you ever stopped to consider underwear in the abstract? When you really dig into it, some shocking problems are raised. Underwear is something we all have to deal with. Everyone wears some kind of underwear. Even Indians wear underwear. Even Cubans wear underwear. The Pope wears underwear, I hope. The governor of Louisiana wears underwear. I saw him on TV. He must have had tight underwear. He squirmed a lot. Underwear can really get you in a bind. You've seen the underwear ads for men and women, so alike but so different. Women's underwear holds things up. Men's underwear holds things down. Underwear is one thing men and women do have in common. Underwear is all we have between us in the end. You've seen the three-color pictures with crotches encircled to show the areas of extra strength and three-way stretch, promising full freedom of action? Don't be deceived. It's all based on the two-party system, which doesn't allow much freedom of choice the way things are set up. America in its underwear struggles through the night. Underwear controls everything in the end. Take foundation garments, for instance. They are really fascist forms of underground government, making people believe something but the truth, telling you what you can or can't do. Did you ever try to get around a girdle? Perhaps nonviolent action is the only answer. Did Gandhi wear a girdle? Did Lady Macbeth wear a girdle? Was that why Macbeth murdered Sleep? And that spot she was always rubbing, was it really in her underwear? Modern Anglo-Saxon ladies must have huge guilt complexes, always washing and washing and washing out damned spots. Underwear with spots, very suspicious. Underwear with bulges, very shocking. Underwear on clothesline, a great flag of freedom. Someone has escaped his underwear, may be naked somewhere, help. If I were you, I'd keep aside an oversized pair of winter underwear. Do not go naked into that good night.
I'm Barry Miles, and you're listening to the Archive Hour on BBC Radio 4. Back at Savile Row, Zapple 2 had arrived. George Harrison's Electronic Sound was basically an album of George trying to master some new electronic toys. As Richard DeLello explains, George supervised every aspect of the album, right down to designing the sleeve.
I think there was a great deal of Moog synthesizers used, and Moog was, it was rather of a novelty at the time. I would love to hear it again. All I have now is just the album cover, which is framed. George was an amateur painter, and apparently he just went home one day and painted a whimsical and idealized portrait of the Apple press office. He decided that that was going to be the cover, and I've been immortalized with my afro at the time, holding what appears to be a Stratocaster guitar and my bell-bottoms, and holding hands with a cute little secretary named Sally, who will also work there. And it was, again, sort of George's lovely pastoral look at the world.
Apple press assistant Richard DeLello, forever young on the cover of George Harrison's Zapple release, Electronic Sound. Meanwhile, back in East Hollywood...
Damn, I'm all tangled. I'm caught in a spider web, Miles. Help me. Jesus. There we go. Okay. The underground. The place was crowded. The editor told me, Charlie, get some chairs from upstairs. There are more chairs upstairs. I bought them down and we opened the beer, and the editor said, we're not getting enough advertising. The boat might go down. So they started talking about how to get advertising. I kept drinking the beer and had to piss, and when I got back, the girl next to me said, we ought to evacuate the city. That's what we ought to do. I said, I'd rather listen to Joseph Haydn. She said, just think of it. If everybody left the city, there'd only be someplace else stinking it up, I said. And I went to the bar next door and bought 3 more 6-packs of beer. When I got back, they were talking revolution. So here I was, back in 1935 again. Only I was old and they were young. I was at least 20 years older than anybody in the room, and I thought, what the hell am I doing here? Soon the meeting ended, and they went out into the night, those young ones. And I picked up the phone. I got John T. John, you okay? I'm low tonight. Suppose I come over and get drunk. Sure, Charlie, we'll be waiting. Charlie, said the editor, I guess we got to put the chairs back upstairs. We carried the chairs back upstairs. The revolution was over.
With the Bukowski recordings complete, and mixing finished on the Brautigan and Ferlinghetti albums, scheduled to be Zapple's 3 and 4 respectively, I took my tapes back to Savile Row. Back in harness at Apple, I had begun editing the pile of Bukowski tapes on my Revox, but Ken Kesey came by the studio when I wasn't there and borrowed it to record some London street sounds. Naturally, I never saw it again.
Love poem. It's so nice to wake up in the morning all alone and not have to tell somebody you love them when you don't love them anymore.
Love poem. It's so nice to wake up in the morning all alone and not have to tell somebody you love them when you don't love them anymore.
Paul really, it was his idea to do Apple, and once he started going, you know, Paul was very active in there, and then it got really chaotic and we had to do something about it. When we started doing something about it, the reality is that he was outvoted 3-1, and if he doesn't like it, it's really a pity, you know, because we're trying to do what's best for the Beatles as a group or best for Apple as a company.
I've got two alternatives. I've got one of just falling in with the fold and Klein and going with Klein and going with the group and doing what the other three want to do on their sort of path. Or I can just sort of do what I think's right. My opinion is that the Beatles, having finished as a group, I believe that the relationship, certainly the spirit in which we started the group, the whole idea, I thought, all along was if anyone is in trouble, wants to get out, is in a sticky situation, the idea is that we'll sit down and, like, see what we can do about it. Whereas, in fact, it's just the opposite that's happening.
Love poem. It's so nice to wake up in the morning all alone and not have to tell somebody you love them when you don't love them anymore.
With Alan Klein now firmly installed at Apple headquarters, there was no need for the Beatles to pretend that they loved one another anymore either. Paul and John, in particular, had drifted far apart, with Lennon a vociferous supporter of Klein, and McCartney strongly opposed to his presence at Apple.
I think once Paul and John's differences came to the surface, the vibe really changed. Once that division had happened, they were finally able to articulate their hostility towards each other. Are we looking at a divorce here? Are Mom and Dad going to be breaking up, and what's going to happen to us?
The end was nigh, but for the moment I carried on with my Zapple work, and it was sounding good.
Santa Rita Blues for Joan Baez, if she wants it. A man in jail is nowhere, and his name is nada, though he still owns his own soul, if he ever owned it, and he still owns his own body, though the state has numbered it and hung it on a rack. His life is like a train, blowing its strange, lonely whistle in the night, and all trains are strange and lonely in the night, like him. Oh, a man in jail is counted, but he himself does not count, and he is not numbered in the who's who of the world. He's numbered among the missing who have disappeared from the world, their souls still in them, if they ever had souls, somewhere lost in the night like lost ships whose hulls are also numbered, sounding their strange, lonely whistles. And all ships are strange and lonely in the night, like him. Oh, a man in jail has his days numbered, and he counts them in the night, and he stands up for the count, and each day he dies a little to make it through that day, and he wishes he could live a little like his jailers, like us. And they are strange and lonely in their own private worlds, like him, like us. Santa Rita Prison, January 1968.
I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the mid where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not rid over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires.
During the summer of '69, I returned to New York to record with Allen Ginsberg. With Alan Klein, now Apple's business manager, I sought and received assurances from all four Beatles that they were still behind the Zapple project. In New York, we met with Klein, who gave the Ginsberg album the go-ahead. We started work at Capitol Records studios, but just 2 weeks into our sessions, I was notified by a telegram from Apple that Klein had folded the entire label as part of his cost-cutting regime. Eventually, Apple's Ron Cass and Peter Asher both left Savile Row and moved to MGM. They agreed to lease the Ginsberg album from us if Alan and I completed our recordings, so work was resumed at Apostolic Studios on East 10th Street, so called because it was a prototype 12-track facility, and the album was eventually released.
Father, Father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast. Speak, Father, speak to your little boy, or else I shall be lost. The night was dark, no father was there, the child was wet with dew. The mire was deep, and the child did weep, and away the vapor flew. The little boy lost in the lonely fen, led by the wandering light, began to cry, but God ever nigh appeared like his father in white. He kissed the child and by the hand led, and to his mother brought, who in sorrow pale through the lonely dale, her little boy weeping sought.
The Apple dream was over, and with it went Zapple. I was stuck in the States, with no obvious way home, until a check arrived from Savile Row, and I dejectedly made my way back to London. As Richard DeLello and Derek Taylor explain, Klein's arrival at Apple had changed everything forever.
There was nothing ambiguous about Alan Klein. You sort of knew where he was at immediately, and, you know, what his agenda was. And despite the fact that, you know, Paul hated Alan Klein and John loved Alan Klein, thought he was right, I mean, Klein was brought in to cut costs, and he did exactly that. And obviously, you know, a venture like Zapple, well, that's sort of a no-brainer. That's, you know, I'll show you the books here, how we're not going to be wasting any more money. You know, we have some fellow out in the field running around with a tape recorder and, you know, piling up hotel bills, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need this. And, you know, what is it going to do for you?
It was too much for the people who were there to run. They weren't skilled in administration, of course, and how could they be, and why should they be? So no one was really running the place. It was running itself, and even the places can't run themselves. They have to be run. And somebody had to come in and do it. And it turned out that it was Alan Klein. And he reshaped it in the way he wanted it. And that meant cutting back and cutting out, cutting down. I suppose making it viable, though probably not quite as jolly as it was. I mean, thank God for a couple of years of jolliness.
I asked Krishnamurti for his autograph, and he replied to me, "It smells too much of vanity. It smells too much of vanity. It smells too much of worldly vanity." So I said, "I see you're dead." And so I asked old Krishna next. I asked him for his autograph upon a Black Power petition. And he replied to me, "Oh, I never eat meat, though I wash my feet, for it smells too much of vanity. And therefore, see, I cannot be hung up on this calligraphy."
There's nothing wrong per se with naivete. I don't think that's a crime. It's not one of the, you know, the 10 Commandments that thou shalt not break. Thou shalt not be naive. I think it was rather charming that they were so innocent and open to, well, ultimately we're turned into a hailstorm of criticism and negativity. The Beatles were never about cynicism. It was a completely positive vibe that was being thrown off, and anything and everything was possible. And it was a really cool idea, and if all of that stuff could have been done, you know, the Beatles could have had anyone on the label. They could have been, you know, William Burroughs would be doing this, and, you know, Ginsberg, and, you know, all of those cool people would have done anything to have been a part of this.
I suppose it was not practical, really, to have all those great ideas at that time. It'll all happen somewhere. Someone will do it, you know. Something like having a good idea. It was a good idea at the time, and still is. But no one can tell what's going to happen or how people are going to relate to each other. All sorts of things happen there. That's life, isn't it? It's very healthy in that way. Much better, really, than all living on one estate in Norwich. Much better.
Karma Repair Kit, items 1 to 4. 1. Get enough food to eat and eat it. 2. Find a place to sleep where it is quiet and sleep there. 3. Reduce intellectual and emotional noise until you arrive at the silence of yourself and listen to it. 4.
The idea of Zapple was typical of the age. Exploration, experimentation, finding new ways to do things. It was a great idea, but ahead of its time. Because records were so expensive to make and distribute, we could never have brought costs down enough for people to buy them as they would a magazine. Paul McCartney, who had been so involved in making Zapple happen, never released anything on the label. Even so, the Olsen and the Bukowski albums were the only professional recordings either of them ever made, so we did manage to capture something for posterity. Had the label been allowed to develop, I believe it could have had a major role in the arts community of the time. In the days before video, before CDs, before the internet, it was a forward-looking venture, and I'm proud to have been part of it.
Yes. Through the Looking Glass. Part 1, Imagining LSD. Deep blue haze Electra wings through, illimitable. White bird in it, far off, skimming, or a white plane skating way down there. Small shadow of it, sweeping the shrunk landscape, disappeared now into the great brown ground, as if fallen, while its plane still flies on miraculously. And Sunday Chicago appears at end of autumn carpet, stuck to great flat blue cloud of Lake Michigan, stretched out, rich resorts and lakeshore fronts, beaches lapped forever, pavilions asleep in time. Hum of Electra winging down, wigging down, seat belts on, flaps down, swinging around for re-entry into that world. Engine drones like a tambura, passage to India on LSD Airlines, temporary flight of ecstatic insanity.
I beg your pardon, sir?
Hello? We're still on the line, you know.
Well, we don't know what's going on just yet. Don't panic and just keep calm.
Well, I'm afraid it's a crinkle in the tape. I'm afraid it's a crinkle in the tape of the high-face super surfers.
Z is for Zapple was presented by Barry Miles. The producer was Owen McFadden.